An overlooked verse in the discussion about drinking is 1 Peter 4, verse 3. For the time past of our life may suffice us to have wrought the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lasciviousness, lusts, excess of wine, revelings, banquetings, and abominable idolatries. There are three words in this verse that deal with drinking alcohol. The first is excess of wine in the King James Version. The Greek word is oinophleugia, which is only found in this verse in the New Testament. This is a compound word. You might recognize the first word, oinos, wine, obviously in this verse, alcoholic wine. The second is fluo, to bubble up or overflow. Thus, literally, an overflowing of wine. This word stresses the amount of alcohol a person consumes and the obvious effect that follows. Remember, that's the central idea of this word, and there's little debate about its meaning. That's why many translations give the word drunkenness for this Greek word. The second word is revelings. Some translations have carousings. This is from the Greek word komos. This word refers to a revel, carousal, that is, in the Greek writers properly, a nocturnal and riotous procession of half-drunken and frolicsome fellows who after supper parade through the streets with torches and music in honor of Bacchus or some other deity, and sing and play before the houses of their male and female friends, hence used generally of feasts and drinking parties that are protracted till late at night and indulge in revelry. That's from Thayer. This word emphasizes the unrestrained, party-like atmosphere that goes with drinking. The third word in 1 Peter 4:3 is banquetings in the King James Version. This is from the Greek word patos, which means a drinking. That is the most literal English translation of the word. This word is a noun. When you see the word potable or non-potable today, you're looking at English derivatives of this Greek word. What is being drunk or how much depends on how it's used. In this verse, there's obviously something sinful about it, and that's the drinking of alcohol. These Greek words in 1 Peter 4, verse 3 are in the plural form. In fact, all the sins Peter mentions are plural: lasciviousness, lusts, excess of wine, revelings, banquetings, and abominable idolatries. That makes the first word involving alcohol a little hard to put into English. Excesses of wine or overflowings of wine, but the plural denotes different kinds or forms of drunkenness. The second word indicates various types of carousing and revelries. The third word, patos, is the plural potois, which means drinkings, that is, different kinds of drinking. It's a more general word for drinking alcohol than excess of wine or drunkenness. These three words are similar in that they all involve drinking alcohol, but each word emphasizes a different aspect of it. The first word, oinophleugiai in the plural, stresses the amount of alcohol a person has consumed and the effects that it has on the person drinking it. The second word, komois, again in the plural, describes what people do when they drink. They party and make fools of themselves. The third word, patois, is drinkings. The amount is not the central idea. The first word, oinophleugiai, translated excess of wine or drunkenness, is the word that indicates that element. But potois is broader. In Greek usage, it may or may not involve drunkenness or carousing, but it's not confined to drunkenness or carousing. This is the most direct word in the Bible on the subject of drinking alcoholic beverages. These three words are not interchangeable terms. Peter's not repeating the same thought with each one. He's not saying that they were guilty of drunkenness, drunkenness, and drunkenness. Synonyms share a basic idea, but synonyms are not exact semantical equivalents. That would be what we call in logic a tautology. For instance, words like triangle and three-sided figure are tautologies. Bachelor and unmarried man are tautologies. But synonyms give slightly different aspects of the same basic idea. And in the case of 1 Peter 4:3, that shared idea is drinking alcoholic beverages. The word patos is only used this one time in the New Testament, so we can't look at other verses to see how it's used there. But the relationship between these three words in the internal context of 1 Peter 4:3 indicates there is some difference of meaning between it and the word for drunkenness and also the word for reveling or carousing. Let's look briefly at how patos has been translated. We'll start with some older translations. The Latin Vulgate has potationibus, which means drinkings or banquetings. Wycliffe has drinkings. Tyndale has drinking. The Geneva Bible, 1560, has drinkings. Now, more modern translations tend to expand, and I believe unnecessarily, on the meaning of patois. The ESV has drinking parties. The New American Standard Bible has drinking parties. The New King James Version has drinking parties. This may be the source of some of the misunderstanding about this word. The words drinking bout or drinking party may leave the impression that a patos was an occasion where all the Greeks did was drink as much as they could and get drunk. I'm not denying that that sometimes happened or even often happened. I am saying that drunkenness is not the exclusive point of the word. The word patos is not just another word for drunkenness. Let's go to the Septuagint translation to see how it's used there. In this Greek translation of the Old Testament, the consistent emphasis is on a feast or a banquet. For instance, Lot urged the two angels to come to his house in Genesis 19. The Septuagint says in verse 3 that Lot made a feast, patos, for them, and baked unleavened cakes for them, and they did eat. Does that sound like this patos was a drinking party? That Lot and these two angels got drunk? There's no indication at all that they were even drinking alcohol. On the other hand, sometimes alcohol was served with meals called patos in the Septuagint. Some at those banquets drank until they were intoxicated. In 1 Samuel 25, Nabal had a banquet, patos, at his house, as the banquet, patos, of a king. And the heart of Nabal was merry within him, and he was very drunken. 1 Samuel 25, verse 36. The Septuagint also uses the word patos in Judges 14 when Samson made a feast for his friends. That's verse 10, 12, and 17. It's used in 2 Samuel 3, verse 20, where David made a feast, patos, for Abner. It's used numerous times in the book of Esther for royal banquets. It's used in Ecclesiastes 7:2 in the Septuagint. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, patos. In most cases, the word patos is used in the Septuagint in a general sense without any clear indication of drunkenness. The one time where a patos clearly involved drunkenness is in 1 Samuel 25, verse 36. And we don't know that because of the word patos. We know there was drunkenness because the Bible specifically says Nabal was very drunken. What we don't find is that every time you see the word patos in the Septuagint, it means a drinking party where everyone at the feast was drunk. But let's dive a little deeper into the meaning of the word patos. Let's look at what ancient Greeks did in these feasts or banquets. Plutarch wrote that Pyrrhus was upset that the people of Tarentum wanted him to fight the Romans for them while they stayed at home, bathing and feasting themselves. In response, he closed the gymnasia and the public walks and also put a stop to the patus, or drinking banquets, revels, that is, comus, and festivals. These patus could have involved drunkenness, especially since they're mentioned with revels or carousings. But these patus or banquets are also mentioned with things that don't necessarily refer to drunkenness: public walks, gymnasiums, and festivals. The letter of Aristeas, written around the 2nd or 3rd century BC, mentions a king holding a banquet, which Aristeas called a patos, and also, interestingly, a symposia, which means drinking together, and thus the word symposium. Now, the symposium in ancient Greek was often a gathering of Greek men who drank and talked about politics and philosophy, but drunkenness, though it may have occurred, was not the focal point in a traditional Greek symposium. At the banquet, Aristeas mentions and calls a patos, they were toasting, especially to their health. The king, in the fullness of his joy, began to drink to their health. The king did drink a long sip in one of these toasts, but there is no clear emphasis on drunkenness. One record clearly shows that the word patos referred to a meal where people were drinking but not drunk. Xenophon, writing about 400 BC, described one of these banquets in detail. High-ranking Greek military officers and Thracians gathered for one of these feasts. Xenophon said that they were seated in a circle, and then the dinner was brought in and served. Servants brought in 3-legged stools that he says were piled up with meat and had huge loaves of bread fastened to the meat with long skewers. They feasted on this meat and bread as much as they wanted. Xenophon says, then beakers of wine were brought round and everyone partook in turn. He mentions one man who was a huge eater. He said that when the cupbearer came to him to give him wine, the man refused and told him he was busy, evidently eating, and said to him, give it to someone else. Then Xenophon says something very interesting. He says, when the drinking, patos, had somewhat advanced. So before the drinking had advanced, it was already a patos, a drinking. And he doesn't even say they were all getting drunk. In fact, he mentions one of the officers who addressed the crowd. He said the man got up and said some words to the audience, and his observation was the wine had perhaps a little mounted to his head. Perhaps a little gone to his head. Does that sound like he thought the man was drunk? In fact, there is no mention of drunkenness in this account. I'm not saying everyone was sober. I am saying there were different levels of how much the people drank, and that is the basic idea of patos, drinking. The amount of alcohol people consumed in these patoi is not specified in many of the usages among Greek writers. They may have drunk a little or a lot. What we do see is that they were drinking. But we're reading these texts with biased eyes if we assume that they always and necessarily involved drunkenness. Trench, in his work Synonyms of the New Testament, wrote that the word patos does not necessarily imply excessiveness, though it does provide an opportunity for excess. In his comments on 1 Peter 4, verse 3, A.T. Robertson wrote, in the light of these words, it seems strange to find modern Christians justifying their personal liberty to drink and carouse. Now, let's take a look at how modern lexicons interpret, and I do stress the word interpret, the word patos. Art and Gingrich have drinking, especially a drinking party. Thayer has a drinking or carousing. Brill's dictionary has drinking or symposium. Liddell Scott has drinking bout, carousal. Moulton Milligan has a drinking bout, and they refer to the meaning of the word banquet or feasting in Genesis 19:3, and also the letter of Aristeas. Notice that the first word these lexicons use is drinking, not drunkenness. Art and Gingrich admit that patos is a general word for drinking when they say it means drinking, especially a drinking party. Here again, we find that the words drinking parties or drinking bouts tend to give the idea that a patos was a party where alcohol was the main, if not the only thing served, or some kind of competition where the participants tried to outdrink each other. But as we've seen, that is not the sole idea in ancient Greek usage. The people at a patos ate and drank. But let's go to an overlooked Greek lexicon that was written long before any well-known lexicon in use today. Hesychius of Alexandria compiled an impressive list of thousands of Greek words. And although he composed this Greek lexicon after the New Testament was written, sometime in the 400s or 500s, he was still much better acquainted with Greek than German or English scholars who lived well over 1,000 years later. His native language was Greek, and he didn't just list words used in his day. His work incorporated earlier lexicons that showed how Greeks used these words. So how did he define this word? Hesychius gives these Greek words for the meaning of patos. First of all, euokia. That is a word for banquet or feasting. This is one of the definitions that he gives. Like the word patos, this word sometimes involved eating and drinking and drunkenness. In one account, it was part of intemperate living. Polybius says that King Agron died from drinking patos and other indulgences, but it didn't always refer to such indulgences. Josephus, for example, used this word. And we're talking about the word euokia, which Hesychius says is a synonym for our definition of patos. Josephus used this word, and he said that when a Jewish child was born, the family were not allowed to turn feast, euokias, into an excuse to be drunk, methe. How could Josephus say these occasions were not to be used as an excuse to get drunk if the people at these feasts were drunk anyway? The second word is the word ariston, a word that in Old Greek meant breakfast but later meant dinner. And then you have the word deipnon, the word that means the evening meal. Hesychius used these words to define patos. If patos necessarily means drunkenness, then why didn't he give at least one Greek word to denote that idea? There were Greek words he could have listed that clearly meant drunkenness. Oinophlugia, methe, tripale, all of which are used in the New Testament. Many today argue that the essential meaning of patos is a party where people were drunk. If this is true, then why didn't this ancient Greek lexicographer give at least one Greek word for intoxication as the meaning of patos? When lexicographers today give the meaning of a word, they cite where that word was found in ancient Greek literature, in addition to showing how it was used in the New Testament and sometimes in the Septuagint. Think of the extra-biblical sources as footnotes. How did they arrive at the meaning of the word in question? They didn't define the word or give it meaning. They simply observe and interpret how a word was used in those ancient Greek writings. But many today say that patos in 1 Peter 4:3 only and exclusively refers to drunkenness. How do they try to prove this idea? First, they argue that when ancient Greek writers mentioned patos and komos as a pair, that is, drinking and carousing, they both involve drunkenness. But the problem is, that's not what we find in 1 Peter 4:3. He doesn't merely say they walked in revelries and drinkings. He says they engaged in drunkenness, revelings, and drinkings. Peter already used a clear word for drunkenness. That's oinophlugia. If komos or revelry goes with anything in this verse, it goes with that word. Not everything in the list of sins Peter mentions has an overtone of drunkenness. Peter begins the list in 1 Peter 4:3 by talking about lasciviousness and lust. In 1 Peter 1 verse 14, he mentions their former lust. In chapter 2 verse 11, he tells them to abstain from fleshly lust. In 1 Peter 4 verse 2, he says we shouldn't live for the lusts of men. These would include drunkenness, but they certainly could not be limited to it. And what about the abominable or unlawful idolatries he mentions? The word patos is mentioned before them. Does that mean that it has some necessary primary connection to idolatry? I'm not saying that lasciviousness, lust, and these unlawful idolatries couldn't involve drunkenness. What I am saying is that that is not the distinguishing aspect of those words, and it is not the exclusive word of apatos. The burden of proof is on those who are trying to limit patos to drunken parties rather than to drinking in general. And it will take more than simply saying that it appears along with these other sins to prove that. And those advancing this argument will have to explain why patos must mean drunken parties and drunken parties only when he already condemned drunkenness clearly in the same verse. Words are to be taken in their usual sense unless the context demands otherwise. The word patos means drinking at a social meal or banquet, whether that drinking is to excess or in moderation. Why would commentators and others be so insistent in saying that it only refers to drunken parties in this verse unless the presumption is that social drinking is acceptable to God? Second, many argue that the context in verse 4 indicates excessiveness in the sins of verse 3. Therefore, the drinking in patos must be excessive. The King James Version says the Gentiles think it strange that you run not with them to the same excess of riot. The New King James has flood of dissipation. The Greek word anakosis means an overflowing or pouring out of something. The reasoning they're giving is that apatos must be drinking to excess because verse 4 says this lifestyle was one of excess. But think about the words in verse 3. Peter mentions lasciviousness. Does that mean he is only condemning a flood or pouring out of lasciviousness? Does verse 4 imply that it is okay to be guilty of lasciviousness occasionally or in moderation? When he mentions lusts, is he implying that lusting in moderation is acceptable as long as it's not a flood of lust? And this would mean that drunkenness or excess of wine in verse 3 is wrong only when done in excess. This reasoning is not even consistent with the phrase in verse 4, excess of riot or flood of dissipation. Do these words imply that riot or dissipation is okay in moderation? Of course not. One of the reasons for misunderstanding on this subject is a failure to grasp the nature of emphatic language in the Bible. Consider the wording unlawful or abominable idolatries in 1 Peter 4:3. Does that language imply that idolatry was acceptable as long as it was not abominable or unlawful? Other verses are just as clear on this point. James 1 verse 21 says, we are to set aside overflow of wickedness. Does that mean we can be evil as long as we don't overflow with it? In 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 2, Paul said not to be soon shaken by false teachers. Does that suggest that taking a long time to be shaken is all right? In Luke 21:34, Jesus told the disciples not to let their hearts be weighed down with carousing and drunkenness. Does that imply that they could carouse and be drunk as long as they weren't weighed down with carousing and drunkenness? Some have actually suggested that drunkenness is not sinful as long as it is done in moderation. The New Catholic Encyclopedia in 1967 said that no absolutely compelling argument can be drawn from the scriptures to show that isolated acts of drunkenness, uncomplicated by association with other kinds of wicked action, are mortally sinful. But don't let the qualification mortally sinful fool you. It goes on to say imperfect drunkenness is per se no more than a venial sin. It could be a grave sin if indulged in for a gravely sinful purpose or if it caused serious scandal. On the other hand, it is no sin at all. That's drunkenness. Is no sin at all if there is sufficient reason for the indulgence. For example, an acute attack of melancholy, a special occasion calling for something unusual in the way of festivity and joviality. I'm not arguing whether this is the official position of the Catholic Church today. I am saying this is a logical quandary of the way that many interpret the Bible on this subject. Advocates of social drinking tell us that not being given to much wine in 1 Timothy 3 verse 8 and Titus 2 verse 3 implies that you can drink a little wine for recreation. If that is the implication, then not being weighed down with drunkenness in Luke 21:34 implies that you can be drunk as long as you're not weighed down with it. Someone might say, you're only using one word to make a case against drinking. But if this one word condemns drinking, then that's enough. However, this meaning of patos is consistent with Bible teaching on the use of alcohol. Proverbs chapter 23, verses 31 and 32 says, "Do not look on the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it swirls around smoothly. At the last, it bites like a serpent and stings like a viper." Verse 31 says not to look upon the wine in the cup. The verb is a form of the Hebrew word ra'ah, which means to see. To look upon here does not mean simply to see with the eyes. It means to look upon with favor, with approval, with interest. This word is used in Habakkuk chapter 1 verse 13, where the prophet said about God, "You are of purer eyes than to behold evil." That is, God cannot look at evil with approval or favor. Since Solomon said, we are not to look at wine with approval or interest, then how can anyone say it is right to take that cup and drink it? Again, we hear the objection, you're taking that out of context. Read the verses after this. He's talking about drunkenness. Solomon does talk about drunkenness here. He says in verse 29 that alcohol will give a person grief, wounds without cause, and redness of eyes. He says in verse 30 that this happens when one lingers long with wine. He talks about lack of restraint, dizzy feelings, and addiction in verses 33 through 35. But just because Solomon describes the results of drinking to the point of obvious intoxication doesn't mean that it's all right to drink less. When he says not to look on the wine, he is saying not to start down that road. He warns where it can lead. But even if it doesn't end in drunkenness, it's still wrong. Consider the sin of lust in Proverbs 6. Solomon warns against being seduced by evil women. He said, "Do not lust after her beauty in your heart," in verse 25. Then in the next 10 verses, he describes what happens when a man commits adultery with a woman. He will pay for his sin. Here's the point. It's not wrong for a man to lust after a woman only if he then commits adultery with her. The lust is wrong even if he never commits adultery with her. That's what Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 5, verse 28. The word lust in those verses is not merely a physical desire. It is a longing a person chooses to feel toward a woman he has no right to be with. Acting on that lust by committing adultery just makes it worse. If lust for a woman in Proverbs 6 is wrong even if a man doesn't commit adultery with her, then taking the first drink in Proverbs 23 is wrong even if a person doesn't get drunk. This meaning of patos in 1 Peter 4 verse 3 is evident from three things. First, the internal context of 1 Peter 4:3, which indicates both similarities and distinctions in the three words used for drinking alcohol. Second, Greek usage before and after the time of the New Testament. And third, this meaning is consistent with the overall context of passages that forbid drinking, like Proverbs 23:31 and other verses like Proverbs 20 verse 1. Here's a question. For those who say the Bible condemns drunkenness but not drinking, if God had wanted to say that drinking is wrong, how could he have said it more plainly than to use a Greek word that means drinking?